Good morning. It's July 4th weekend, and it's wonderful to have my former colleague, current colleague, longtime colleague, and competitor, Brian Sommer. Brian and I go back to when we were competitors at Accenture and PwC, respectively, and we've done a lot of work since together. And most of it is focused on the back office, HR, finance, shared services, etc. Today, we're going to focus on HR and the heroics that he's been seeing in the last 3 months as we go through this crisis. Brian, welcome aboard, and let me know if Colleen put you to work over the July 4th weekend. I know you cook up a storm, so she probably took advantage.
I did a lot of cooking, but most of my time was spent actually consoling our German Shepherd, who doesn't like fireworks, as it turns out. And it sounded like Armageddon was unfolding behind our house yesterday. That was pretty amazing, actually.
I've heard a little bit of Benadryl helps.
I don't know. I just seem real odd saying that I've got a German Shepherd and the German Shepherd was scared, all in the same sentence. It just doesn't seem right.
Brian, I would be afraid of you too. So, Brian, spend a minute describing to the audience your background, and then we can jump into some of the conversation.
Well, like Vinnie said, he and I were mortal enemies when we were on different sides of the Big Four table. For a decade, I ran Accenture's software intelligence unit, but I also had their finance and their HR centers of excellence as well. For almost 20 years now, I continue to keep working as an industry analyst on the finance and HR side. And obviously, I keep checking in on companies and clients all over the place. So, I'm still knee deep in that space for sure.
So, Brian, we've seen some amazing heroics in the last quarter, right? Obviously, all the healthcare, frontline workers, but also amazing corporate backflips, right? So auto companies jumping in, trying to make medical ventilators, 3M quadrupling in 95 mass production, all kinds of last mile logistics, amazing volumes. Banks jumping in, doing 4 million PPP loans in a month. It's just been staggering how much people have been required to do and have stood up and delivered. You've been watching some of the HCM heroics. Tell us about some of those.
Yeah, we got to give a hat tip to a lot of the people in the HR space because of the tremendous amount of work that they've had to do in the last just few weeks and months. In fact, I'd say for a lot of them, it's been a whole career's worth of HR activity in the last 6 months alone. What they've been dealing with, layoffs, trying to get people kitted out for work from home, dealing with all kinds of questions like how do I do performance reviews and salary administration, how do I even answer phone calls from staffers. They're trying to do all that in a compressed amount of time. Add to that just the incredible number of changes that have come out from a government regulatory perspective at state, local, and federal levels, including things like finance coming to bug them about, can you help us with this paycheck protection program and other CARES Act kind of things. So, hat tip to all of them for doing that. That's a lot of work.
Brian, do you think we can codify some of what they've learned in the last 3-4 months so we don't have to rely on heroics again?
I would.
Or are we going to encounter, because we're going to encounter relapses, second waves of the virus, other future health issues?
I know we're seeing a resurgence, relapse, what's going on. That's already happening in the news, and we see that in the news. I did some calls late last week, and I found out that some companies in the South that had tried to do partial reopenings have had problems with more new cases popping up in their workforce since they've reopened, and they've had to close back down again. We need to get we need to get some of this stuff kind of codified, but I also think there's a question of what can we do to make sure that people are acting with the best available kind of tool sets that they can. I think we're seeing a lot of infrastructure challenges that HR may not be able to solve. And one example is the use of the availability of high-speed internet access is not ubiquitous around the world. Maybe we all can, globally, we can find a way to get pretty good, broadband speeds or whatever, internet access speeds on smartphones or cell phones. But I have seen a lot of reports in a number of Asian countries, for example, that broadband did not exactly go into a lot of people's homes. There were other problems too, really around like just the general level of preparedness to be able to do something like a work from home initiative. There's a very, very acute shortage of laptops around the world with some major employers. I believe it was Google I saw in one news story. I think they were the ones looking for some 5,000 laptops. You and I both know a vendor, Plex, that rolled up their shirt sleeves and pulled together about 50 or so old laptops at their office and sent them out to a customer of theirs that was in the middle of an implementation when the pandemic and the lockdown and stuff kicked in. So we definitely need to see some change.
Ron, I would say even in the US, bandwidth has been spotty because people are competing with their kids who are trying to go to school, and they're competing with their neighbors because we're on the same node. Bandwidth is absolutely something people will have to, the telcos hopefully are going to address.
I think I know what you're talking about. I know one CEO was competing with his own kids in his house because they were between the homeschooling that they were downloading and doing courses online and with video games they were playing. This guy's trying to do Zoom calls 24/7, and he had to get the cable company come out and bring another dedicated line, a dedicated router, and a dedicated cable modem just for him. So you could argue that's a rich person's kind of problem, but that's a very real problem in a lot of families where you've got homeschooled kids sucking up a lot of that bandwidth right there. Yeah. So there are definitely some new problems that have popped up along the way.
And we haven't even talked about some of the social isolation issues from working from home and all that. Let's come back to that. Let's, I heard Mark Benioff, the CEO of Salesforce, say, is this a pandemic or is it an epidemic? He said, it started off as a health crisis. Pretty soon it became a financial crisis. Then we had the diversity in race relations crisis, right? It would seem like HR has probably borne the brunt of the last two, right? Maybe the health crisis was something the facilities people and the medical folks had to deal more with, but certainly the whole what to do about it, and then now the diversity issues have smacked HR pretty hard. What are you hearing?
Well, these are two big issues right now, and you're correct in pointing out these are two things hitting HR at the same time. And I know that sounds obvious, but there might be some listeners going, but Brian, HR's always had to deal with equal employment opportunity and other kind of discrimination kind of issues. Yeah, but whether it's the Black Lives Matters or other movement variants, the focus on discrimination has become very much front and center. And I'll give you an example.
Even if it's not at the corporate level, it's at societal level, right? So you just can't ignore it.
True, but let's take it. Let's dive into this a little bit more. There's a lot of interest in HR right now to pick up a number of new technologies, including things like artificial intelligence. But what HR folks really have to be careful about is that if the big data that these new machine learning tools is going to rely upon shows the effect of prior discrimination, the new tools are just going to replicate that. So HR's got to be very careful there. I'd also say that as we get ready to think about this pandemic leveling off at some point and then restarting, reopening, and regrowing the economy, HR's got to be very careful to find out, are the people that we're bringing back into work, are we doing so in a non-discriminatory fashion, and in particular, or are we going to do some things that a lot of companies have done in the past after recessions, which is they want to come back and only bring back in the cheap, the young worker, and they're going to basically screw around with the older workers. So there's discrimination not just against people of color, but also on age and sexual orientation and a whole bunch of other dimensions. And all this really needs to get a crisp new look.
Brian, the other thing I've been interviewing a number of operational executives, and I'm hearing that some of the older workers actually may use this trauma. It really has been traumatic for everybody to actually think about early retirement. And that would make it even more difficult for HR, won't it? I mean, if you lose people, if they consciously are trying to focus on bringing back younger workers and the older ones can't wait to get out, that would make it even tougher.
No doubt about it. I can't believe I'm going to say this, but I'm getting to a point where I have to think about retirement. And the question I have to ask is, how long will the recession that follows all this pandemic, how long is that going to last? And how hard do I want to think about like some kind of retirement stuff? Right now, no, I'm not looking at it, but the fact of the matter is, yes, even I'm thinking about it. And I bet, Vinnie, if you were being truthful, you would probably admit some thoughts along those lines as well.
Brian, don't retire. I need somebody to compete against. So let's go back to the race relations, though. Brian, one thing that corporate jobs have become a lot more sensitive to that, right? It seems like the society, certain segments, could be the cops, could be whatever, are a little more uneven. Would you say that's an unfair statement? I sometimes find the corporate reaction is, what are we talking about? We've been doing a lot of this already proactively. Why are people singling us out? What would you say?
Well, give me a taste more context on that, if you don't mind.
Well, I mean, clearly, you see a lot of the police brutality and so on. That is becoming a major focus, and it needs to be addressed. I can't think of too many corporations that you could say, yes, they are absolutely racist. Maybe because we deal with tech companies, tech professionals, and so on, we don't see it as much.
Well, the one thing you can say that you see is there's a whole slew of Silicon Valley firms whose average workforce ages out at about 27 to 29 years old. There is discrimination, and there's discrimination also with a lot of male-dominated kind of Silicon Valley firms. And I'm not just picking on that one industry. You find lots of boardrooms still, and executive committees are still underrepresented on a number of different demographic kind of fronts. So it's still there. Now, it may not be quite as in your face as what it used to be years back, but it's still there. And I would tell you that I rarely run into it in a blatant way when I'm out dealing with clients. I really don't. And to a great extent, I don't see a lot of people doing something consciously and viciously to do some things. Although I would tell you that there are some institutional behaviors that need to get addressed. For example, if you're an employer and you tend to hire a lot of college graduates and you only interview people from certain kinds of schools, you are going to direct a bunch of maybe white upper class kind of individuals into your employment ranks at the exclusion of others. So that's
a good point. Yep.
Anyway, it needs to be addressed.
So Brian, the financial damage from the crisis is very uneven, right? It reminds me of William Gibson, the science fiction writer, who said, The future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed, right? So, Workday reported 1 million paycheck payroll in the middle of the pandemic, right? Clearly, that customer is not hurting. We've seen obviously the PPP loans, community banks. I interviewed a community bank president. He grew 25% in a month because he jumped at the opportunity. Residential mortgage refinancing has been on fire. RV sales are on fire, right? So there's sectors that are doing amazingly well. And on the other hand, there are others that are down in the dumps. Airlines are down to 5-10% capacity. Just one example, commercial real estate. I mean, there's a whole bunch of industries that are really hurting. This is where employer reputations get made and lost, right? Especially when they start to hurt very deeply. What are you hearing about good and bad behavior when it comes to employee furloughs, employment, etc.? Talk about the brand, the employer brand through this crisis.
Yeah, so there's a recruiting brand and an employer brand, and you usually talk about them both. They're different, but they're very related. There's been some situations where I cringed when I learned about a company. We all know this one major .com kind of company. They cut loose 3,700 people in a 3-minute Zoom call. Now, if you're going to try, and they ended it with a sentence that was, and this marks the last day that you'll be working for X.
A lot of empathy right there.
Yeah, lots of empathy. Now, I know I ran this comment and that story by another couple of industry analysts we know. And they were going, well, Brian, look at the times these companies had to make big cuts. Zoom was the only way to do these kind of things with, work sanctions and everything else. While there's truth to that, on the other hand, I'm not sure that a 3-minute call to basically obliterate 3,700 people's employment was exactly, hitting on all the touchy-feely kind of, bullet points. I doubt that hardly any of those 3,700 people will ever want to go to work for that company if they ever got another chance to do so. They're not going to do it. And I got to believe that the Glassdoor rankings for that company are in the toilet, as are a bunch of them from others. There's a couple of things to think about. When this pandemic broke loose, I interviewed 2 or 3 HR companies that had some really cool machine learning kinds of applications, and they could match people up out of adversely affected industries with open positions in companies that were booming. And so we saw a lot of movement of people who were servers, waiters, wait staff, whatever, in restaurants. They were picked up by a lot of them by grocers and brought in to help in restocking efforts in these stores. But we also saw another company helped some of the big drugstore chains and hospitals hire a bunch of fast food restaurant managers. Why? Because those people know how to manage people who work different shifts, 24-hour shifts in some cases. They know how to adjust schedules and. Well, I'm telling you this because a lot of people that got furloughed and laid off, they left their old employer and they're not coming back. They've been added to the workforces of other companies and other industries. And so there's a double-edged problem here. If you're a firm who cut a lot of folks loose, even in a normal recession, you'd be lucky to get 50 to maybe 70% of your old workforce back. Now you've got this situation where technology has come to bear. It's helped some of your people that used to work for you. They've now found true love elsewhere and they're not coming back. So your recruiting brand has been dinged. Your ability to get your old workforce back has been hurt. The challenge going forward is going to be, if you were struggling to win the war for talent a few years, for the last several years, you're really going to struggle when the economy starts ramping back up again.
Yeah, and I've heard of another company that is trying to work with state unemployment offices, similar, mapping them to employers that are looking, right? So the good news is a lot of creative work being done in mixing and matching available talent. Let's talk a little bit about automation, Brian. I mean, clearly we had a scare a few years ago that automation was going to take over all the jobs. It didn't happen. But I'm hearing now, as companies think about redoing their supply chains and they're bringing manufacturing jobs back, they go, we can't afford to bring them back at US wages. There's got to be quite a bit more automation if you bring them back. And you're seeing that over and over again in different industries. People are exploring drone deliveries, robotic process automation, et cetera, right? What has always bothered me is it affects humans, it affects employees, but HR has stood by the sidelines when it comes to automation. Do you think it's going to change this time around?
I think you're going to see HR have to make a couple of big shifts. Just the old transaction processing aspects of HR have got to start going away. They need to start embracing more robotic process automation, workflow exception handling, machine learning, and a whole bunch of other stuff. They're going to need all those technologies, including chatbots. They've got to get the non-value added, the low value added work off their table, because the amount of things that HR must deal with going forward is growing and changing. And that idea of HR as an area that just handles a lot of people-based transaction stuff is an outdated way of looking at that process area. So I fully expect to see HR is going to have to be, as a piece of the business, is going to go through some kind of transformation itself. More and more of it has to become, I'm going to say, digitally transformed, although I really cringe at that label, because what's going to change is not so much that, their transactions have already been digitized, for a long time, but it's the way the work gets done, that everything happens through all kinds of very smart electronic methods. That's where, the growth has to go. And that's just the first part, because the second part is, we know that you're going to see a whole lot more robotic process automation, more smarter kinds of machine tooling on the shop floor. You're going to need, HR is going to have to start recruiting, hiring, training, and developing a different kind of worker. And that's probably one of the biggest strategic jobs steering HR square, straight ahead, is when does HR get the time to go work on those kind of problems? That's why it has to free itself up from all this non-value added or low value added work, just so we can start tackling the more strategic deals. So yeah, it's time for change.
I was asking somebody I interviewed, an operational executive, I said, Industry 4.0 is coming to the shop floor. Where are you going to find your talent? And he goes, it's interesting, Vinnie. I can take a young college graduate who has an interest in computer science and data science. Mm-hmm. They actually will make the best shop floor workers, because a lot of what we're going to do is collect a lot of shop floor data, and they'll have to make some decisions based on that. So you're right, completely different workforce. We'll have to go with all that automation, and HR will have to step up for a very different kind of recruiting and training and so on. Right, so let's, as we reopen, a number of companies are reopening. HR is being forced to become a facilities manager, a medical officer, et cetera, right? I mean, there's a lot of issues around thermometer checks and distancing in workplaces and so on and so forth. Where does HR get the time? Or are they outsourcing it to the medical officers and the facilities guys?
Well, excuse me, if HR isn't smack dab in the middle of these kind of discussions or activities right now, they really, really need to be. And I'll give you a very practical reason why. So I was interviewing a senior finance exec, a corporate accounting leader, and I was asking how the pandemic stuff was rolling out in their organization. She starts off by telling me about all these major employers that are in adjacent buildings to theirs. They're in a giant, office, complex. And she goes, every one of those, starting in early June, tried to do a partial reopening, and within 2 weeks, they all had small outbreaks of coronavirus popping up in their offices, and they shut back down again. But her firm, the back office group, they want to be the first ones to kind of reopen in their firm. And she's got some serious concerns about it. Number one, the area in the country where she lives, she still has problems trying to find any kind of personal protection equipment for herself. On her floor, there are 100 women. There's one bathroom, and that has to serve them all. She doesn't like the idea of riding an elevator up 20 floors to her deal when they're going to put 4 people to an elevator that she believes safely could maybe accommodate 2. And I could go on and on. She was telling me that right now their FP&A group is heads down trying to find the next round of layoffs so they can save about 20-30 million a month or more in savings. If she refuses to go back into the office, she knows that'll put her to the top of the layoff list. If she goes, she's afraid she'll put her first to go to the hospital. So, HR needs to be aware that there are people, whether in operations or other parts of the company, they're going to be making some opening decisions that are going to create some significant morale and health issues for employees, and that could come back and eventually even end up in litigation issues. And HR either has to get in front of it or will be spending way too much time cleaning up after these kind of mistakes later on. So HR needs to be in front of these things, no question about it. And that doesn't even address one of the things. This particular executive lives in a major city that has a pitiful mass transit system. But if you look at folks who work in towns like Chicago and New York City, where there are big, robust, jam-packed mass transit train systems, you got people worried about, am I going to get the disease on the way to work or the way home? I mean, HR really has to get on top of this, no question about it.
Brian, it's kind of interesting. We've been talking for 15 minutes and we haven't talked about HCM technology at all. What does all this mean for?
That's the fault of the interviewer, not mine. Not mine.
What does it mean for the vendors we know and love? And there is a thought that, as you pointed out, HR is going to have to get out of the tactical areas. So maybe more outsourcing. Paint a vision for where you see the HCM technology market headed.
Well, there are a lot of parallels there in what's happening in the finance market. One thing's for sure, anyone who's still sitting on old, on-premise, heavily customized, patched kind of technology, they're going through some pain right now, particularly if they're companies who either had to do some significant contraction or expansion. Those solutions do not scale or scale well. For the vendors, I think for those that
by the way, Brian, every CIO I've talked to in the last couple of weeks, that the cloud applications help the migration to work from home far better.
Oh yeah.
On-premise, all the VPN tunneling issues, provisioning more sockets and all that was not that easy.
And let me take it a step further. Where there are problems, a lot of them I saw years ago are still there, where companies still have some very bad or broken manual or sneakernet kind of integrations. And HR actually is, in a typical larger firm, they'll have 100 integrations into the payroll and HR systems. They've got benefit providers, payroll systems, different ones in every country they operate in, and I can go down the list. But a lot of those don't create great integrations back like to the general ledger. And somebody's always having to pull up a spreadsheet, make a number of manual corrections, and then manually upload that or push that back up into another system. And it goes the other way around as well. You still see that with problems with time tracking systems, where people are having to manually adjust someone's time to load that into like payroll and the like. And when you could get away with that when everybody came to the same physical place to do work and you could hand that stuff off, you can't do that easily in a work from home kind of world. And so those manual integrations are a problem. But specific to the vendors, I think any software vendor who didn't get their cost structure in order in the last decade really screwed up. The vendors that embrace more open source technology as opposed to relying on third party, let's say relational databases, technology that they used, or those that didn't embrace hyperscalers early on and tried to build out their own kind of cloud environments. Those that continued to defend on-premise when the writing on the wall was there for all to see for multi-tenancy for the last 20 years, that we've seen had multi-tenant solutions out there. In fact, if you hear a vendor that's still bragging and crowing about their incredible install base of on-premise customers, run to the hills and get away from them. Folks, no one's bothered to build really an on-premise HR system since about 1999. Let's move along with the times. We got 20 years to catch up. But a lot of these vendors, frankly, they didn't modernize their solution, and now they have products that are rigid as all get out, not malleable, flexible, or anything else for the chaotic, dynamic times to live in. They are expensive to operate, and finally, their cost structure cannot allow them to ever reduce the pricing of their technology. And if your company shrank like you mentioned, the airlines or the hotel industries or the movie theater business, there's a bunch of industries that really took it bad. You would hope you had a vendor that would actually let you reduce your computing bill by a commensurate amount. And yet most contracts and most vendors would not let you do that. Folks, if you've had the heart-to-heart with your vendor and they were pretty heartless back at you, seek true love elsewhere.
Brian, so you're saying move to something new. Here's a reality check, right? What I'm finding is most companies are investing in what I call vertical edge applications. Whatever is helping them make new revenue, right? So it could be telemedicine in healthcare. It could be last mile logistics in restaurants and retail. It can be PPP processing for banks. This world has opened up a whole bunch of new opportunities, revenue opportunities that traditional systems just did not support. So the money's going there. And the other thing I'm hearing from CIOs is cost optimization, right? Mm-hmm. So given those two pressures, how does an HR person go and say, move me to the cloud or give me something better than I have today? How would you recommend they do that?
If you're in one or two extremes, if you're in high growth or your company's really been ravaged, you can build an economic business case on why you need to move to a completely different kind of solution to better handle either the growth or the contraction, get the cost structure right. You're correct that a lot of, there's been a triaging going on of where IT spend is going to go. And there's a very limited amount of capital. And, I'm not going to sit here and say that companies still magically have access to all kinds of cash, because even if they have the cash, they're hoarding it. They're really sitting on it right now. Right. So building a business case for this kind of stuff, it takes some work. And that's probably a whole webinar or whatever, on a whole recording on its own.
How about this option, Brian? Stay with your on-premise, but get out of the data center business, move it to a hyperscaler like an Amazon or Microsoft, and then move to third-party maintenance.
Yep.
You don't have to keep paying your publisher for a system that hasn't been upgraded in a while, but you can lower your operational costs.
I heartily endorse that idea. I would definitely recommend go get some virtual machine software, put it up on that hyperscaler, and then call somebody like a Remini, a Spinnaker, or whatever. Get them to maintain that old stuff if you think you're going to be getting off of it in another couple of years. And knock on wood, I think from a planning and forecasting perspective, with all the different drug companies working on vaccines, I think within 2 or 3 years, we should all have one out by now. And I think the economy will start making a recovery. Whether it'll be a super robust and, bounce back immediately, I don't know. But I would say you should be going ahead and laying the groundwork to, take that trash out and get it out to the curb at some point soon.
Brian, 2 to 3 years, you're an optimist, aren't you? Let's touch on, clearly, as you mentioned, a whole bunch of new regs, right? State, federal, my God. I mean, it's like, it's going to be a nightmare to do a 941 every quarter anymore. What about outsourcing?
I don't have a problem with outsourcing, but a lot of what you get when you outsource is you get a lot of standard kind of practices. If you want HR, for example, to really do something unique and powerful and everything else, only outsource the tactical stuff.
The transactional stuff,
yeah, outsource just the transactional stuff. That's it. Yeah.
Yeah, the regulatory stuff. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
No problem there.
What else? What final words of counsel do you have for HCM professionals?
Ooh.
You're never short of words, Brian.
Well, I think the first thing I would tell everyone is if you kind of got caught a little by surprise by this pandemic, you probably didn't have a lot of great plans in place. You probably didn't have continuity plans, contingency plans, and on and on and on. And I think more than anything else, the planning is what HR really has to focus in on. And let me get real specific on this. Did you plan for like major layoffs or rapid growth? And if you're planning for growth, well, the first plan you have to think about is we've gone through a firefighting stage, and for some companies, they're still going through it. They're still making layoffs and cuts. In fact, I just saw American Airlines may have some 20,000 extra employees going into this fall that they're probably not going to want to carry on their payroll. So the pain is not over with in some companies, and others are still growing, and some have had a surge and now it's tapering back off. The grocers don't quite have the shortage problems that they used to have a few months ago. So what the planners have to do in every function is to work with others in their company to find out what are the signals we see out in the marketplace that let us know that another change is about to hit us. So if you're a grocer, how do we know when the demand is actually and supply are getting back in sync? HR's got a lot of plans to do about what kind of headcount do we need, when do we need it, where do we need it, what skills do we require, where we're going to get it from, and they have to have those plans in place, because once the company has leveled out and is going to start doing the growth, you don't start planning for the growth when you're in the growth cycle. You should have had that plan done well in advance. So we've got some, I know some people call that middle step, the stabilization phase, but whatever you want to call it, every one of these requires a plan, and plans are there. They need to be there. You're not going to follow the plan exactly the way you dreamed it up, but you need the signal tracking to know when a change is coming, and you need to have a pretty good idea of what's going on. I would liken all HR people, they need to start thinking the way that military battlefield commanders think. And that is, they might have had a great plan of attack that they drew up in some war room, but once they get to the battlefield and the first stray shell hits their ammo dump and blows it up, now they've got to make a change and dynamically adjust and shift. But what doesn't change is their overall objective, and they'll keep a lot of the tactics that they'd already come up with, and they will remember some other alternatives that they had dreamed up when they were coming up with the initial plan anyway. Planning, as boring as that sounds, Vinnie, that's got to be job one for HR today.
Brian, I mean, I'm hearing from a number of companies, they're looking at a three-step plan, right? Survival short term, stabilization, and then growth. So you're right. Each one of them requires very different type of planning. Yep. And given the state we are in, kind of a W recovery, up and down, it needs to be, like you say, be prepared to change very rapidly. So agility trumps perfectness.
Yeah, I'm getting... I guess a little lighthearted here. I can't stand hearing the words resilient, agile, and the other word I hear too much is unprecedented. So this was these are unprecedented times, Vinny, and this is an unprecedented WebEx that we're doing here right now. So
it's a Zoom, by the way. It's not WebEx.
Zoom, yeah, sorry.
Get with the times, Ryan. Get with the times. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vinny. Appreciate it. Good to see you virtually, at least.